Hospital Porter's Pride and Dignity, Stop the New World Order. Welcome to Hapanwo TV, and welcome to this, the third in my series of studio quality videos based on lectures that I've delivered live. This one is called Helen Duncan, Wartime Psychic Jailed, and it is based on a live lecture that I presented twice now. The first time I did this was at the High Wycombe Paranormal Group in August last year. Since then I have been contacted by a member of Helen's family. I have got an awful lot of updates which I have put into this lecture. I presented it for the second time with those updates on the 4th of March at Truthjuice Nottingham. Very grateful to all the people there for hosting the event. Thank you very much. And now I'm doing this studio quality version of it. Although someone might have filmed it, I think. Someone might have filmed the actual lecture I did. Anyway, this, as you know, Hapanwo, Hospital Porters Against the New World Order, is my website, and the franchise covers things such as government cover-ups, ghost UFOs, and things of that nature. So you're talking about basically supernatural and conspiracy. And this case that I'm going to talk about in this video is very, very interesting because it combines those two elements, which is why I think I'm so interested in it. It's also, I think, and it involves a terrible injustice, and I'm also very, very keen on dealing with injustice because I don't like it, and whenever it comes up I always have to stick my oar in, shall we say, and kick up. So that's why I think I'm involved in this particular subject. Anyway, this here is me, or that's what I used to look like, the portering Buddha. Yes, I was a hospital porter, hence the name of the Hapanwo franchise, Hospital Porters Against the New World Order. There's a guy in America, or there was, he died now, called Jack McLam, who had a group called Police Against the New World Order. So I thought, if police can have an organisation against the New World Order, why can't hospital porters? Anyway, I got sacked from my job. I was discharged from the hospital portering service in what I think are mysterious circumstances which are related to what I'm doing with Hapanwo. And another reason why I'm so interested in the case of Helen Duncan is because it has eerie similarities to my own predicament at the hospital and about what happened to me. There's a lot of material online. I've done some videos, articles, I've been interviewed by other people on the radio and TV about my discharge from the hospital, and if you read those and watch those where I give you the details, you maybe understand the similarities between this case I'm going to talk about this evening and the ones involving my own predicament at the hospital. So that's a long story. I can't tell it all this evening, but there is this sort of like association, this parallel, and I think I sympathise with the subject of tonight's talk for that reason. Anyway, this here is me, or that's what I used to look like, the portering Buddha. Yes, I was a hospital porter, hence the name of the Hapanwo franchise, Hospital Porters Against the New World Order. There's a guy in America, or there was, he died now, called Jack McLam, who had a group called Police Against the New World Order. So I thought, if police can have an organisation against the New World Order, why can't hospital porters? Anyway, I got sacked from my job. I was discharged from the hospital portering service in what I think are mysterious circumstances which are related to what I'm doing with Hapanwo. And another reason why I'm so interested in the case of Helen Duncan is because it has eerie similarities to my own predicament at the hospital and about what happened to me. There's a lot of material online. I've done some videos, articles, I've been interviewed by other people on the radio and TV about my discharge from the hospital, and if you read those and watch those where I give you the details, you maybe understand the similarities between this case I'm going to talk about this evening and the ones involving my own predicament at the hospital. So that's a long story. I can't tell it all this evening, but there is this sort of like association, this parallel, and I think I sympathise with the subject of tonight's talk for that reason. Now, the subject I'm going to talk about tonight happened a long time ago. In fact, it happened 71 years ago. Yet I think it's still very relevant. It is still a mystery. It's still unsolved. There's a lot of loose ends that have not been tied up. And as I said earlier, it involves, I think, a great injustice. And I think it's very relevant to the world we live in today. It's the kind of thing that could happen again. And so for this reason, I think it's very, very important that we keep talking about this particular subject. I've been told I shouldn't. Several people have said to me, "Oh, can't you let it go? Don't talk about it. Just forget about it. It happened a long time ago. It doesn't matter anymore. Just shut up." Well, no. I'm not going to let it go. I'm not going to shut up. I'm going to keep talking about it. Now, the story I'm going to tell you this evening centres around this woman here. And as I said, it's a very relevant story to the world we live in today. And I think her experience affects us all. And has an influence on our lives. Well, this lady is called Helen Duncan. And she was born in 1897 in Perthshire, Scotland. And of all the photographs of her, and there's plenty of them, this is my favourite. This is one taken in her youth. And what amazes me here is the expression on her face. It's really quite incredible, and if you look at her eyes, you may have to get closer to the monitor, but there's an extremely dense, deep and intense look in her eyes. And they say the eyes are the windows on the soul. Well, this is quite a soul. Now, Helen, from a very young age, had the nickname Hellish Nell. Now, this was not so much to do with her abilities, which I'll talk about this evening, but more her personality. She was very fiery. She was a bit of a tomboy. She was willful. She tended to dominate. She had a loud voice. She used to swear a lot. She could get angry quite easily. Nobody messed with her. She was a pretty typical Scottish woman, actually. But I think from the day she was born, people knew there was something different about her. She stood out in many, many different ways, but in a peculiar way. She, well, for example, one of the things she used to do was she would go into a trance in the middle of the school, and well, she was sitting in a class with the other children and the teacher, and she would suddenly go into a trance and start shouting strange things, portents of doom and things like this, and it would frighten the other children and teachers very much. Another interesting anecdote which her granddaughter has related is that she had an ability that if when she was sitting in school with an assignment and she couldn't do it, she'd put the school book underneath her chair, pull it out, and the answers would be filled in by somebody. It's a very interesting thing. But what I'm basically saying is we're talking about somebody here who had psychic powers, for want of a better word, mediumship abilities. She was in touch with the other realms. I think everyone, from what I gather, when she was young in Scotland, everyone was a little bit scared of her, but nobody disliked her. Everyone, I think people appreciated her quite a bit, because she actually came in very useful at times. There was an instance during a very harsh winter when somebody went out for a walk and they got lost in a violent blizzard, and the people in the town where she lived sent out a search party to try and find this person before they froze to death. And Helen used her abilities to find this person, to guide the search party. She went with them and she basically led them. This is when she was a young girl. And these abilities are what we would today call remote viewing. She was able to see where this person was, even though she couldn't perceive it with her normal senses. So she's really quite a remarkable young lady. And as she grew older, the skills she had allowed her to develop. She became more and more skilled with them. She learnt to use them, and she eventually became a professional medium. Now, as regular Hapano TV viewers know, I have a very open mind when it comes to things like mediumship. I do attend a spiritualist church quite regularly, not every week, but as often as I can. And I appreciate what these people do. I don't believe the skeptic side of the story at all, which I'll go into. So I think there's a lot of reality behind mediumship. But Helen was a particular kind of medium, a very exceptional kind of medium. She was part of a very elite group of psychic mediums, of which today there are very few, even fewer than there used to be. And this is the realm of physical mediumship. Physical mediumship being the ability to actually influence the physical world using the mediumship abilities in various different ways. Now there's many different things that physical mediums do. Some of them can just produce sounds. One of those sounds is what's known as raps. This is not the kind of it's not the sort of Kanye West Lil Wayne kind of rap. This is knocking sounds like this. And so many of them can do that. Some of them can move objects, and some of them, including Helen, can actually produce images. And I'm talking about physical manifestations of spirit. Now I'll explain a little bit more about what this is. Manifestation is what it's known as, where the medium will actually, not only relating the words of a spirit in the spirit world, but will actually produce an image of this person in a three-dimensional solid image, which can be these vary in sort of like quality and type, but they very often resemble exactly the person who is manifesting. And this is very often done through something called ectoplasm, which is a material substance which actually issues from the medium's body, very often from the nose or mouth, or sometimes from under the fingernails and various other places, which will actually form into in front of your eyes, into the shape of a physical person or another object. It's actually quite remarkable. I've never seen this done. It's extremely rare. I know people who have, and they've told me they've been very impressed by it. Now, the skeptic view of mediumship is that it's all fake, and that people like Helen Duncan suffer from temporal lobe epilepsy, which is a form of epilepsy where you see visions and go into strange altered states of consciousness, and that either that or they are frauds. Well, I disagree with that, and I'll explain some more about that as I go through the course of this evening. See, now Helen worked as a professional medium, like I said, and she made some considerable money from that. And of course the skeptics will say, and they always say this, well, it's just a money-making scam, isn't it? You see, she was just out in it to make a load of money. Well, look, the situation she was in, right? Her husband was very ill. In fact, both of them were too ill to work in a normal job. Her husband was a cabinet maker. He used to make furniture. He was just like a carpenter kind of thing. He was very sick all his life. He had to give up his job. She herself was very ill and couldn't get a normal job. So she had this ability to be of psychic mediumship. She had a choice. She could use that or not use it. She could use it and earn a living from it, which I think people are entitled to do. You're entitled to earn a living from your abilities. Or she could choose not to, and she could actually do her duty and sort of like prove herself to the skeptics by not using her ability at all, or doing it for nothing, and living in poverty. Remember, she had a large family. She had about 8 children, I think, and several grandchildren as well. I know one of the grandchildren. What was she meant to do? What would you do in her shoes? Now, if you Google Helen Duncan's name and you start doing a little bit of research into her background, or you go down the library and you look at some books about her in the good old-fashioned way, sooner or later you're going to come across these photographs, and obviously there'll be some commentary and narration with these photographs as well. And this will say that, well, look, Helen Duncan was a fraud because she was caught in the act. This is a photograph taken of Helen Duncan during a seance. And you can see here, actually, Helen is here, apparently in a trance, producing these figures, which are said to be ectoplasm. But what they actually are, as you can see very obviously, are dolls or models. They are fake. The the faces there are, I think, are papier-mâché and painted, and they're just model faces, and the effect of the body is produced with a coat hanger. You can see the shoulders of these figures. You can distinctly see the coat hanger shapes underneath. There's the sort of like rainbow coat hanger on the one on the left, and on the right there's the sort of like the ones, the coat hangers with the straight bit and the thing sticking up at the end. So these are obviously models, fake. So the skeptics will say, well, there we are, we have a photograph of Helen Duncan in a seance faking the effect that she says she can do. Now that's wrong, and it's misleading. And there's a guy in Australia, there's two people, there's a man called Victor Zammit and his wife Wendy, who've done an awful lot of research into this, and they have discovered the truth behind these photographs. All right, these photographs were taken in 1928, and the photographer's name was Harvey Metcalf. And the fact of the matter is, this is not a photograph of Helen Duncan in a seance. This is a photograph of Helen Duncan posing for these photographs to demonstrate what her seances would look like if they were photographed. These models were made specifically for the photograph. Okay, Helen probably made them herself and said and demonstrated she was making them. The reason is these photographs were taken for a magazine. This magazine was doing an article about manifestation mediumship, and they just wanted a reconstruction, a mock-up of what a manifestation seance would look like. Taking photographs of real manifestation seances is extremely difficult, and it's extremely hazardous. It's not least for the medium, because for reasons I'll explain later, bright lights such as flash bulbs are very, very dangerous in a situation where a medium is producing ectoplasm. This is why there's always near darkness when these events are taking place. So, like I said, these are photographs taken from a magazine, which were Helen created this this effect. It was done in bright lights, probably in daylight, with a window nearby, with a photographer nearby. This wasn't a real seance. There were no sitters there. This was just a reconstruction of a seance which Helen staged for the purposes, with the agreement of the photographer and the magazine, and it was never, with the readership of the magazine presumably, that when the magazine was published it was never meant to show the real figure of a seance, and Victor Zammit, he found this out. Yet this photograph is used again and again and again by skeptics to claim that it's proof of Helen Duncan's chicanery and being a charlatan. And you'll see that again. I mean, these photographs appear on Helen's Wikipedia page, and I'll be talking more about Helen's Wikipedia page later. But it's important to realise this is the kind of misunderstanding that can often be generated, and the truth is often lost through the passage of time. And statements like, well, this is Helen Duncan in a seance and it's fake, right? These can be repeated just again and again and again, with no one checking into the background, until eventually the truth is lost. And this is how you can actually damage a person's reputation. And this was done again several times. Similar things like this were done to this woman, and that's an important part of tonight's story. This here is a more accurate representation of the kind of things you would see at one of Helen Duncan's seances. As I said, there are some photographs of ectoplasm, but only a few. Now, what happened was, when Helen was manifesting these spirits over time at various different seances, certain spirits kept coming back again and again, and these were ones which became Helen's spirit guides. One of them was a man called Albert. Now, he was a middle-aged man who spoke with an Australian accent. He had actually lived in Australia and died in 1909. Also among Helen's regulars and spirit guides was a young girl who was about 5 years old called Peggy, and she often appeared in ectoplasm as well. And in the end, these two spirits in particular began acting almost as a kind of master of ceremonies. When Helen went into a trance and she began manifesting spirits, these two, Albert and Peggy, would often come forward and almost just to introduce the other spirits to the sitters, because very often she performed in front of a crowd, which I'll describe later. And I've got a little bit of an audio clip I want to play for you. Actually, it's an audio clip which was actually recorded during one of Helen's seances. This is extremely rare. There's very, very few actual of recordings like this of Helen. I don't think there's any film of her. I don't think there's any recordings of her voice when she's speaking that survive. So here we go. This is apparently Albert or Peggy speaking at a seance.
Next person to come here, I want someone just like you, but further back towards the corner there, to ask a young lady out that passed to our side. Now I have a feeling that she's had an operation of some kind.
Is there something else?
Will you try her on?
Come on, dear.
No, she doesn't move on your right.
No.
Yeah, I know a young lady.
Yes. Do you know her name?
The young lady, it's the name of Kathleen.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Will you call her out? Please.
Well, come along, Kathleen.
Oh.
Have you any message for Charles?
Yes.
Have you?
But I'm all right, but if I make me happy.
You are?
Make me happy.
Oh, that's lovely, Kathleen.
I'm
Absolutely.
showing them.
I didn't expect to see you, but it's just lovely. Is there anything else I can tell Billy?
That's all.
And that is said to be a recording from one of Helen Duncan's seances. It's can't be verified, unfortunately. There's no date on this particular recording. The quality's not that good, so it's a bit hard to tell exactly what's going on there. Yeah, I thought I would play that for you because I think it's interesting. It's an interesting historical document. Now, by the late 1920s, Helen Duncan's business was booming, and she was hot property. She had no end of invites and offers to attend seances, to attend spiritualist churches, to carry out readings, and of course this included in those days psychical research laboratories. Now, psychical research is still going on. There's several organisations, including the Society for Psychical Research, which is about 170 years old now, I think, and it's still going on today, but it's died down from its heyday in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was a really big thing back then, and it's not so much now. But basically, Helen was invited to attend a laboratory in London where they wanted to try and study her about what she was doing and work out whether she was real or not and how she was doing it with all the mechanisms and stuff like that. So she jumped on a train for England, an all expenses paid trip to London, to the laboratories of the London Spiritualist Alliance. Now, this trip proved to be very troublesome indeed for Helen. What happened was, at the end of these tests, at the end of this study, she was universally denounced as a fraud. There was a lot of literature published in the specialist psychical research press, but also in the mainstream media as well, saying she was a fake, she was a fraud, she was just using various sleights of hand and props and things like that to create the image, to create the illusion that she was a physical materialization medium. And of course, from on the surface, it looks, well, that's obviously what she was. The reason she was denounced as a fraud is because she was a fraud, and that's what the skeptics still say today. It's very simple. But I wonder if that isn't a slightly oversimplistic way of analysing this situation, because there were other factors involved here. Now, not least to do with the fact that there was a lot of rivalry in psychical research in those days, and spiritualist investigation, and that Helen, when Helen came to London, she wasn't the only. The LSA's laboratory wasn't the only one who wanted her. Okay, the LSA got her, but many other groups and organisations and individuals wanted her, and there was some kind of tendering process they had to go through legally, and the LSA won, leaving all the others a bit miffed. And one of those was this guy, Harry Price, who is a maverick and an absolute legend in the field of psychical research. He was a lone maverick, and he operated on his own in his laboratory with several assistants. And he wanted Helen to come to his laboratory, and he couldn't because the LSA got her. And so there was a bit of a trouble, you see, because what happened was Price approached Helen privately and secretly while she was in London and offered her a large amount of money to come to his laboratory and do some work there. and not to tell the LSA that she was doing it. Now this was a bit of a tricky situation because of the rivalry that I was talking about. Now Harry Price, as I say, he was this lone wolf. He was this solo operator who didn't get on with many of his peers. He's as I said, he's very well known. He has an official website. If you Google his name, harryprice.com, it's there. Although I don't think he set that up himself, because he died in 1948. But it is his official website, and you can read about his work with Helen Duncan on there. The thing about it is, when Helen Duncan went to his laboratory, the LSA, as I said, didn't know, and they would never have agreed to it, because I think Helen was caught up in the middle of this rivalry between the two sides, because when she went to the LSA, she actually signed an exclusivity contract. And the thing about it is, I don't think she really quite understood what that involved. And so there was a bit of a... When this was tendered, right, when all the tenders were put in and the LSA got it, she signed this contract. Helen then went to Harry Price and did some extra tests at his laboratory, and when the LSA hit the roof, when the LSA found out about this, I mean, they eventually got wind of it. They hit the roof. They were absolutely furious, and you can imagine there were some very heated phone calls between the officers of the LSA and Harry Price's laboratory. So basically, Helen was caught up in the middle of a blazing row between the LSA and Harry Price, and I think this may well have influenced what happened next. Now, what you'll often hear is that Helen, got into a temper in the laboratory, and she did. As I said, she was a fiery personality. She got very angry with Price. She shouted and hurled abuse at him. She assaulted her husband and ran out. Apparently, she ran out into the street at one point and created a bit of a scene. The official story is because Price wanted to X-ray her, and she didn't want to be X-rayed because, according to the skeptics, she'd have been caught out if she was. Now, the thing about it is, it was a standard textbook trick in those days for fake psychic mediums to hide props, various things which they could use in the seance somewhere on their body. So in their mouth, under their armpits, in their pelvic region. Yes, there. Makes the mind boggle, doesn't it? God. So she agreed to have. They wanted to give her a full examination, her entire body checked from top to bottom, and she agreed to this. And I'll say more about this later, because she ended up doing this at every séance she did as well. She had a full examination by Harry Price's female assistant, and this was a nurse called Molly Goldney. And then she went on and she sat in the laboratory. Price was there with his camera, and she went into a trance and began materializing. And Price took a series of photographs, and these are the photographs. Now, what you've been seeing here is Helen tied to a chair. This is important to realise. She's actually, I'll say more about the seance procedure later on, but basically she's tied down to this chair. There's a ligature around her wrists and ankles. She's completely naked under this black covering, this shawl she has on, this big black thing. And Price photographed her as she was in this trance. These are the photographs you see. Now, both Price and the London Spiritualist Alliance said that this was a fraud. Okay, what they're saying she's doing is that she has in her stomach, Helen was hiding in her stomach a massive roll of cheesecloth mixed with egg white and tissue paper, and during her séances, supposed séances, she would regurgitate this material, which would then look like this ectoplasm, which is what you see here. This is what she's doing. It's a trick. It's a scam. And Harry Price claims to have a sample of this material. He actually cut a little bit off. I'm apparently he cut a little bit off and put it in a specimen jar, and he analysed it, and he said, "Yeah, tissue paper, egg white, cheesecloth. It's this material. It looks like ectoplasm." I don't know, if I were him, I'd have grabbed a bigger bit of it. Actually, I wouldn't have just cut a little bit off. It's very, very strange. Anyway, this is what you read about if you read about Price's experiment and the LSA's experiments, and this is basically what she was doing, and they denounced her as a fraud. And when they published their results, they said she's a con woman. This is what she's doing, and that's the end of it. But it's very, very strange because, as I said, hardly any of this material was ever obtained in experiments or since in seances. In fact, that's one of only 2 occasions where any physical evidence is ever obtained allegedly of Helen's fraud. Now, the whole idea of egg white, cheesecloth and tissue paper, now this is something that Harry Price says that he found out from his experiments, that he found out from his tests. However, the idea that Helen was doing this, she was basically regurgitating this material, predates Price's experiments. It actually goes back to someone called Mary McGinley. Now, Mary McGinley was an employee of Helen's business, and she actually suggested that Helen was doing this. All right. It turned out later that actually Mary McGinley was probably a spy. She was probably sort of like a mole planted by the LSA to discredit Price. But anyway, this is what she said, and this is what went into Price's report and the LSA's report. Now, the strange thing is, though, that there's been no explanation of the actual mechanism of this. Well, you'd think there would be. You think there'd be some kind. They would need some kind of explanation of the mechanism of how this has been doing. Because if you think about it, it doesn't quite make sense. We're talking about a very large piece of cloth here. You can see in these photographs that it's considerably big piece of material. So what she would have had to do is she would have had to swallow this material, keep it in her stomach, make it invisible to X-rays, regurgitate it, and swallow it again, and all without using her hands and without making a mess. I mean, if you think about it, if you're regurgitating stuff from your stomach, how do you regurgitate this material without also the breakfast you had that morning? You can just imagine what a mess there'd be. She's effectively vomiting this material and then swallowing it again. Everything in her stomach it would be. I mean, there's all kinds of stupid explanations Price came up with, like, oh, she has a double stomach like a cow, and it's stupid. I mean, the X-ray showed she had a perfectly normal stomach. And remember, she can't use her hands. She's tied down, all under laboratory conditions. Now, I've seen skeptics bend spoons. I've seen them do cold reading. I've seen them reproduce seances in the dark. I've seen them reproduce ringing bells and blowing trumpets in the dark. But never have I seen a skeptic swallow a 6-foot square piece of material, hold it in their stomach, throw it up, and swallow it again without using their hands. And there's more. There's more. A short while ago, actually, when I was actually advertising my event in Nottingham, I was contacted by a lovely lady from the United States called Margaret Hahn, and she wanted to know what I was doing first of all, because she was a bit worried about how I was talking about this Helen, and she wanted to know why. The reason she was so interested is because she is Helen Duncan's granddaughter, and I explained what I was doing, and she was very, very helpful. Once I explained what I was doing and where I was coming from, and I showed her my film, Helen Duncan, the most dangerous psychic in the world, she became very, very helpful indeed, and she sent me a couple of documents which I'm going to show to you. This is the first one, and it was published in the Psychic News in 1932, and it's called Mrs. Duncan Confounds Magicians and Freed Herself from Handcuffs by Will Goldston. Now, he's founder of the Magician's Circle and author of more than 40 books on conjuring. So this is a magician, like James Randi, like Paul Zenon, like Richard Wiseman, like these other magicians who all tend to be skeptics. This guy was not a skeptic. This guy knows tricks. He knows how to do magic tricks. Randy's always saying scientists don't know how to do magic tricks, but magicians do. You always got to have a magician in the laboratory. Well, Will Goldston was a magician. Anyway, he writes this. In the case of Mrs. Duncan, the Scottish materialising medium, it is, to my mind, she's one of the most absorbing in the history of spiritualism. For her it has been claimed that she possesses mediumistic powers which, in some ways at least, exceed those of the famous Rudi Schneider. Yet, at the time, she is alleged to be a fraud, and the methods of trickery which she is said to employ are so astounding as to be almost beyond belief. Mrs. Duncan is said to possess a remarkable power of regurgitation. Before sitting, she swallows many yards of tightly packed and specially prepared cheesecloth and rubber gloves. All this material she regurgitates from her stomach during a seance, persuading it in some manner to simulate the human shape. That, with further elaboration, constitutes the persecuting statement. I am one of the fortunate few who have been privileged to attend Mrs. Duncan's sittings. My first experience with her, perhaps the more astounding, as I attended more in the role of an ordinary person than an appointed examiner. The sitting took place in late March of this year, 1932, at a house in North London. The medium's cabinet consisted of 2 curtains drawn across the room. She was in a trance within 3 minutes, and in the course of the next hour and a half some 8 different forms were manifested, of all ages, both sexes, and each possessed of an individual speaking voice. I personally carried on a conversation with a small female form called Violet. She told me she was 8 years of age and permitted me to feel her hand. Now there is not, so far as I am aware, and I am a magician of lifelong experience, any system of trickery which can achieve the astounding results which I witnessed that evening with Mrs. Duncan. Nor am I aware of any system of ventriloquism or voice control which can so perfectly simulate the voices of 8 different beings. After the sitting, Mrs. Duncan repaired in my company to an adjoining room. There, with me, she drank 2 cups of coffee and ate 2 tea cakes. I am not sufficiently a medical man to know to what extent the power of regurgitation may be developed in the human subject, but I should be more than a little surprised if it were at all possible to absorb food and drink into the stomach that is already packed with cheesecloth. The next sitting with Mrs. Duncan was, as far as I was concerned, purely in the nature of a test seance. I had enlisted with me as co-examiners Henry Rigoletto and Dr. A. E. Neal and Dr. O. H. Brown. All 3 are magicians of the widest experience. Previous to the sitting, Mrs. Duncan had been stripped, examined, and entirely reclothed by 2 ladies who were present with us for the whole evening, and who, we were given to understand, were strangers to her. For our part, we could find nothing in the room, or more particularly in the cabinet, which gave us grounds for suspicion. My own seat was about 2 feet from the cabinet. A dim red lamp was used for illumination, sufficient for me to see the curtains clearly and the outline of the medium. The forms manifested on this second occasion were, I thought, a little lacking in clearness and power. Nevertheless, they were essentially of the same type, that is, shining with a curious phosphorescent sheen in the ruby light, and entirely self-illuminating. I was, and still am, completely at a loss to explain their appearance and disappearance by any material means. There was no sign or sound which I could possibly construe into evidence of fraud. Earlier in the evening I had been warned that an old friend of mine was likely to appear in the course of the seance. The form was materialized, but only after considerable difficulty. It had no vocal powers whatsoever. I asked whether it could write anything, and the form nodded its head. After a few moments I heard the sound of writing from within the cabinet, and almost immediately a sheet of folded paper was thrown from the curtains. On it was written the word Lafayette, and Lafayette was one of the best known magicians of the past generation, and was burnt to death on an Edinburgh stage in 1911. It had been arranged towards the end of the evening I should be permitted to secure the medium in any way I thought fit. For this purpose I had brought with me a pair of handcuffs of regulation pattern, 40 yards of sash cord, and 6 yards of carpet thread. When the signal was given for me to enter the cabinet, I was surprised to find the right cuff refused to work, although an hour previously it had been in perfect order. I overcame the difficulty by interlacing the faulty cuff with the sash cord, securing the medium's wrists with a reef knot to prevent finger manipulation. I tied the 2 thumbs with carpet thread, using 8 knots until the thread cut into the flesh. These preparations took some 8 minutes in all. Shortly after I had taken my seat, the voice of Albert, Mrs. Duncan's control, was heard apologising for spoiling the working of the cuffs. "What would you like me to do?" he asked. I suggested that it would be very remarkable if Mrs. Duncan were released. A short space elapsed, certainly no more than 3 minutes, then Mrs. Duncan walked from the cabinet quite free. Now, yeah, so this is cheesecloth and egg white, is it? I don't think so. That, remember, is a contemporary report from a trained magician who attended one of Helen Duncan's seances. He's the ideal person to be a skeptic. He was accompanied by several academics. So what's going on here? It seems likely that both the LSA and Harry Price lied. They concocted a false story of fraud for their publications. Why? And the answer, I think, lies in the politics which I've described that was going on within the psychical research community in London. Basically, they both felt very humiliated and wanted to race. The LSA and Price were basically in a race to the line for who had been humiliated the least by the situation. So this 1930 study is not as conclusive as you might find. Not as conclusive as many assert. It was incomplete because Helen Wright walked out eventually. This is an important point. She walked out of both the LSA and Price's laboratory in a huff and buggered off back to Scotland. She went down to the docks and she caught a coastal ship back to Edinburgh. All right. She left her husband trailing in her wake. So basically, they were humiliated, and both sides they wished they'd never got involved, as I'm sure Helen did too. Also, there was the whole study was riven with this animosity and like I say, this internal politics that was going on. Yet, if you look up Price's study, if you look on his website, you look up any reference to it, or most references to it in academia, you'll hear, oh, it's very simple. She has a double stomach. She was regurgitating cheesecloth and swallowing it again, etc., etc. And this study, this study actually came back to haunt Helen because some years later it was used to blacken her name, and I'll go into that in more detail. So Helen then, what she did was she went back to Scotland to lick her wounds, pretty pissed off. Maybe she had thought at one point, well, at least now things can't get any worse. Well, she was wrong. So Helen Duncan was back home in Scotland. She and the psychical research community in London had parted on very acrimonious terms indeed. Never again would they work together. So Helen was doing her usual. She was doing the seances, she was doing the spiritualist churches, hoping to salvage her career from the terrible publicity blow it had taken. And into her life comes a woman whose character is as sinister as her name. Esmé Maule. What a name, Esmé Maule. I kid you not, that is her name. E-S-S-O-N-M-A-U-L-E. There are not many photographs of Esmé Maule. This is one of the few, and it was taken in 1913. It's about the only one in the public domain. And this was taken in Stirling in 1913 when she was campaigning with the suffragettes. But as later on in life she became something of a skeptic, a sort of female Houdini. But she approached. She wasn't that renowned, so Helen wasn't suspicious when Esmé Maule. God, imagine having a little baby called. Imagine your surname's Maule and you have a little baby called Esmé Maule. What a sweet little baby. What's your name? Oh, her name's Essen. Essen, isn't she? Bloody hell. Anyway, Esmé Maule approached Helen, and Helen was not suspicious. And she said, Esmé Maule was a writer. She wrote some novels. She wrote a screenplay for a film. And she approached Helen saying that she was going to write a book about her. And Helen very eagerly agreed. She didn't have much to lose because she wanted to sort of gain. She wanted to drag back a bit of her good name. So Esmé Maule said that she would meet Helen at a seance at a spiritualist church in Edinburgh, and basically watch her perform her seance and her materialisation, and then that would be part of the research for the book that Esmé Maule was supposedly writing about Helen. But she wasn't writing a book about Helen. It was a trap. What happened was, Esmé Maule was in league with Harry Price, and what happened was, Esmé Maule turned up at the church in Edinburgh. She sat in the audience with everybody else. Helen went into a trance. The ectoplasm was produced, and then Esmé Maule stood up, reached forward, and grabbed it. So that's how the story goes. She switched the lights on, ran forward, and grabbed it. There was a very ugly scene. Helen apparently threw a chair at Esmé Maule, screaming and hurling abuse at her. The police were called. About 3 people were arrested, including Helen, and she ended up in court. Now, what's interesting is that what Esmé Maule was claiming was that Helen Duncan was faking the ectoplasm, and the way she was doing it was, when she stripped off at the start of her seance, she wasn't completely naked. She wore a white cotton slip, and somehow during the seance Helen had taken off this slip and was using that to make it look like ectoplasm. Well, let's have a look at the slip, shall we? Now, this is the white cotton slip. It's a court exhibit, as you can see the labels there on it, and it was the one which Esmé Maule managed to capture. She took it to the police and said that this is what Helen had been wearing. She somehow managed to manoeuvre it off and use it as a piece of fake, as a prop to make it look like fake ectoplasm. Well, firstly, it doesn't actually resemble in any way what some of the witnesses said they'd seen in terms of the realism of the manifestations, and secondly, it doesn't explain how Helen got it on in the first place, because it's about a size 12. Now, you've seen a photograph of Helen. I'll be showing you some more photographs of Helen later in this talk. She was a big woman. I mean, she was 20 stone, and she honestly, would she have worn a size 12 cotton slip? It's ridiculous. But unfortunately, it didn't matter. I mean, there's several reasons why I think that the court case was rigged against her. Perhaps it was the influence of Harry Price. Maybe there are other reasons I'll go into at the end of this talk. But Helen was she was found guilty. She was fined 10 shillings. Although, according to Victor Zammit, the verdict wasn't actually guilty, it was unproven. But she still got a 10 shilling fine. She could have got 3 months in jail. So you could say she got off lightly. And so again, this was a major blow to Helen's credibility. There were lots of news reports about it, which again portrayed her as this con woman, this shyster. But she continued to practice. James Randi, the famous psychic from Canada, I mean, he often makes comments about how difficult it is to beat down these people. He calls them unsinkable rubber duckies. They just keep bouncing back and floating again. However, things changed, honestly. In 1939, the Second World War broke out. Things started to pick up for Helen. I mean, she'd had a lot of bad publicity, although I must say the editor of Psychic News stuck up for her back in 1932, and I think that actually did something to try and mend her reputation and her standing in society. So she did continue to work through the 1930s, and in 1939 there was a lot more need for her skills for obvious reasons. People started dying in vast numbers especially early in the war, during the Blitz. The deaths were, in the end, I think 60,000 people across the country died in various places during the Blitz, and of course everyone had to have shelters, and they had to go into shelters when the air raid siren sounded. Of course, the armed forces abroad, over 300,000 were killed during the course of the war, and a lot of people lost loved ones. Everyone knew someone who'd lost a loved one. Very few families were untouched by tragedy during World War II. And so a lot of them wanted to visit spiritualist churches and seances in order to try and contact those they'd left behind. So Helen was in great demand again. She was hot property once more. She travelled up and down the country, from Land's End to John O'Groats, stopping at different places, living quite well on considerable earnings. But then it all went terribly wrong. And what happened to her with Harry Price, what happened to her with Esmé Maule, problems in Edinburgh, all those things just pale into insignificance compared to what happened next. And in 1941, Helen began one of these many national tours that she did throughout World War II. She went to many places, as I said. One of her most regular locations where she performed seances was the Master Temple. Now, this is a location, it's a kind of spiritualist church stroke seance room in Portsmouth, and she visited that location many times. And I should just tell you a little bit about the seance procedure, because it's important to know exactly what went on to understand the problems that she was to face later on. Now, the seance procedure it's very, very simple, really. A seance room would have a rows of chairs for the audience, and these would be facing a stage, effectively, where she would perform. And this stage would be covered by curtains to begin with, while everyone, so the audience would come in, they take their seats in the audience, while Helen was in another room. Now, as I said, the thing about Helen was she was actually totally transparent. She did everything she could to convince people she was real, including allowing herself to be stripped naked and examined by female members of the audience. She had several people used to come on. If there was a nurse present, the nurse would always be there. Of course, during the wartime, many women were working as nurses, and it was one of the most popular professions. She was stripped naked. She'd have all her body cavities searched in front of all these other women, so she was willing to put herself through this indignity to prove, in a sense, that she was real. She wanted people to believe she was real. And after that, she would put on a big black dress, which with nothing on underneath at all, in front of these women, and then she would move through to the seance room and sit behind the curtains. And what would happen then is that the main lights of the room would be extinguished, and a dim red light would be lit. Now, this is always the way. Now, skeptics will say this is because they want dim light. The mediums want dim light so they can hide their chicanery behind darkness. But no. The real reason is because bright lights can actually hurt a medium while they're in trance. In fact, Helen actually often used to even wear a blindfold, as you saw in Price's laboratory, to try and protect herself from the flash of his camera. And she did this several times. Now, so what would happen is the red light would be switched on. This would be very dim. It would be a maximum 40-watt bulb, dark red light, and then the seance would begin. Helen would go into a trance. Then she would start producing ectoplasmic entities, which would then part the curtains and enter the room and interact with the audience. And I've actually visited the Master Temple myself, and I'm sure you may be familiar with the video of me doing that. If not, you can actually see it in I'll play it again anyway, and you can actually see it, but it's in my video, in my main film, Helen Duncan, the most dangerous psychic in the world. But anyway, what happened was she was in the middle of this like I said, she was in the middle of this seance, and then on one particular day alright, it was actually the 27th of May 1941, something very, very unexpected happened. Okay, what happened was Albert, the spirit guide, he appeared as he always did, and he said, I'm very sorry to have to tell you that a British battleship has just been lost. I have 1,400 of her officers and men here, newly arrived in the spirit world. Well, of course, there was a huge gasp from the audience, because nobody had heard about any ship being gone missing. I mean, there's been nothing in the news. Now, one of the fatefully, as it would happen, one of the men sitting in the audience was Brigadier Roy Firebrace. Now, he was a psychical researcher. He was a paranormal investigator, and he was very interested in spiritualism, the occult, and ghosts and things like that. And he was also an army intelligence officer. So what he did was, immediately after this séance had finished, he went back to he went back home and phoned the Admiralty on the secure line, and he said, "Here, have we lost a ship? I haven't heard anything about it, but have we lost a ship?" And he found out when he got to the right person that yes, indeed, the Royal Navy had just lost an Admiral-class battlecruiser called HMS Hood, which was the biggest and most powerful ship the Royal Navy possessed. So. Yeah, this here is a photograph of the Hood, which has just been released. Oh, correction, it was released later on, but to begin with, the loss of the Hood was kept secret. But this ship, HMS Hood, had been involved in a battle with a German warship called Prince Eugen, and she'd gone down, and 1,412 of her crew had gone down with her. And as I said, this is the flagship of the Royal Navy at that time, by the biggest, most powerful ship they possessed So her loss was an enormous blow to Britain's sea power. So this came at a time as well when morale was very low on the home front. I mean, very, very few people actually thought that Britain had a chance of winning the war, or the Allies had a chance of winning the war. United States had yet to come in, so Britain was basically was on her own, facing the German threat. This is during the Blitz, as I said earlier, with people getting bombed out in their homes. This was a few months after Dunkirk, when the British Expeditionary Force had to flee from continental Europe from the Nazi onslaught. So yeah, I mean, people were down, people were pessimistic. So for this reason, the government decided to keep the loss of HMS Hood a top secret. Even the relatives of the sailors on board the ship had not been informed that their loved ones were dead. Now, Firebrace, as I said, he was a psychical researcher. He must have known what was going on, and this must have marked Helen's card. It's amazing to think, but he must have reported back, and strange as it may seem, Helen Duncan was actually able to gain top secret information on the war effort, classified material that is, from the testimony of the dead. People who couldn't, who were not, you can't put a ghost under their security oath. And so this represented an unpluggable leak. I mean, you know the phrase, oh, he had to die, we had to kill him because he knew too much. We were frightened he would talk, You hear that's a cliche in espionage films and stories, right? Well, what do you do when you can't silence a person, even by killing them? So, yeah, you could bet that the human intelligence services in the country at the time were keeping a very close eye on Helen Duncan. And so they would have known when she returned to Portsmouth the following November. It was actually November the 25th. And basically the same thing happened again. This time, an actual sailor came forward. This was a sailor from HMS Barham. Barham, again, was a capital surface combatant. She was active in the Mediterranean theatre of operations. She'd been attacked by a Nazi U-boat and sunk with a torpedo, and 850 of her men had died with her. And one of the sailors actually came forward and he gave his name, and many years later his name was actually confirmed. But he was in his uniform. He actually appeared as a physical manifestation in his little square rig and his little hat, and which said HMS Barham across the front of it. And one of the audience members was this man's mother, and she suddenly realised her son was dead, and she broke down. And this news spread all over Portsmouth like wildfire. And this was a serious problem because once more, just like with HMS Hood, the government had kept the loss of HMS Barham secret. Yep, this was a really sticky situation from the government's point of view, and there must have been some very hushed meetings in the cabinet war rooms just thinking, what are we going to do about this? What are we going to do with this woman who keeps bringing forth these people from the other side to give away government secrets to the war? Well, for the time being, they must have decided not to do anything. She was allowed to continue to practice because she was not harassed again for several years. So maybe there were skeptics there, I don't know, but they must have just said, "Oh, leave her for now. We'll just keep an eye on her." But we must obviously they were still watching her. This means they would have had agents in the audience, things like that, people sneaking, opening her mail, that kind of thing. Now, that status quo came abruptly to an end on January the 19th, 1944. Helen Duncan had returned to Portsmouth. She was back at the Master Temple and performing her seance there. The police raided the Master Temple in the middle of her seance, and Helen Duncan was arrested. Helen was arrested. She was obviously expecting to go up in front of the local magistrate again under the Vagrancy Acts, just like she had before, and maybe get another fine. If she was unlucky, maybe a month inside. But she wasn't expecting any worse than that. She had no reason to. That was how the state normally dealt with fraudulent mediums, people or mediums accused of fraudulent activities. But no, almost unbelievably, the case was escalated to an entirely new league. Helen Duncan was remanded in custody and then sent to the Central Criminal Court of London, where she faced charges under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. If found guilty, this could send her to jail for 9 months. And what followed is one of the most remarkable courtroom dramas in all of history. And this is a newspaper photograph of poor old Helen walking through the streets of London to the Old Bailey, where she would be tried in a courtroom which was normally only used for traitors, the lords, serial killers, the most serious convicts and the most serious defendants in the country were tried at the Old Bailey. What was she doing? A woman accused of pulling a few parlour stunts to defraud the public of a few pence. What's she doing there? I mean, it's incredible. It's a 200-year-old statute. No one had been yet prosecuted for under the Witchcraft Act that century, the 20th century. So what the hell's going on? So what you think of this matter will depend on your opinions of Helen Duncan and spiritualism in general. As I said, it all began on the 19th of January when she was arrested in Portsmouth. And what happened was, she was in the middle of her seance. It was just like Edinburgh with Esmé Maule. She was in the middle of her seance, and suddenly two of the sitters, who were actually moles, they jumped up and they leapt forward, switching on torches and shining them around. They switched the lights on, just like in Edinburgh, and they grabbed the fake ectoplasm, things like that. One of the two agents, they blew a whistle, and the police, well, basically the police were waiting outside. It was an organised raid. They burst into the Master Temple, you know, as police do, tearing the place up, questioning people, arresting anyone they thought they needed to arrest, etc., etc., shouting very loudly. Now, these two enemies within who were at the seance, the guys who blew the whistle, switched the torches on, and disrupted the seance, they were called Lieutenant Stanley Worth and PC Rupert Cross. So they were, one was a policeman, one was a naval officer. So obviously this was very important to the authorities that Helen should be arrested. So why was it escalated like this? Helen was denied bail. Why? She was at the Old Bailey. Why? Again, these questions keep coming up again and again. And she was facing a charge which you know, the Vagrancy Act could get you a maximum of 3 months behind bars, whereas the Witchcraft Act could get you put away for 9 months maximum. And as I said, this was an archaic act. This was an archaic statute. They basically dusted off. They brought out and just to deal with Helen, it seems. Now, on one level, you could say it's very simple. This is the line the skeptics will take. Helen Duncan was advertising herself as a psychic medium. She was taking money from paying customers to perform as she presented herself, a psychic medium able to contact the spirits of the dead. But the accusation, though, was that she was actually not a real psychic medium, and she was using tricks. She was using sleights of hand, props, mentalism, and various other methods that fake mediums use. So she was basically committing fraud. She was fooling people, taking money from people on false pretenses, and this is what the Vagrancy Act and the Witchcraft Act related to. Now, on one level, as I said, you could say the state had a cast iron case. Firstly, she had a former conviction for that offence in Edinburgh in 1932. She had also been denounced as a fraud by 2 psychical research laboratories. So it looks like an open and shut case, doesn't it? I mean, the state can't lose. The Crown has her in the bag. What's more, when she was given a character assessment at the end of the trial after her conviction, she was described as a pest on society, a heartless exploiter of the vulnerable and grief-stricken, quote unquote, which meant that the judge had no choice but to send her down for the maximum sentence of 9 months. 9 months in prison. Now, on first glance, you might think she richly deserved it. But is it really that simple? I think to answer that question, we need to look at the personnel involved in the trial. Now, the Crown chose the prosecuting counsel as John Cyril Maud KC. He was the man they brought in basically to put the Crown's case against Helen across. Now, this was despite the fact that John Cyril Maud KC was actually already busy at the Old Bailey in court number 1. So he was conducting another case already. He was in court number 1 actually prosecuting a man for murder in, strangely enough, Portsmouth. And he was basically nipping between there and court number 4 where Helen was. But he's to prosecute her for under the Witchcraft Act. Apologies, no. Maud was in court number 1 defending a man accused of murder, which is very interesting. Well, an interesting aspect of that actually is that the defendant actually accused the police of framing him of murder, and he actually won the case. He was facing a murder conviction. In those days, could mean hanging. And he accused Chief Constable Arthur West of Portsmouth Police of framing him for murder. And he won his case, actually, and he was acquitted. What's interesting is that Chief Constable Arthur West plays a major role in the trial of Helen Duncan as well. In any case, Maud was not there half the time where Helen was. He had an assistant. He had a junior barrister called Henry Elam, who was basically conducting the case for him when he wasn't there in court number 4, when he was prosecuting Helen Duncan. So, I mean, why John Cyril Maud? Why was he selected? Now, it's true that Maud had a reputation. He was supposed to be one of the best barristers in the country. He had a very elite upbringing, almost textbook. He went to Eton, then he went to Christ Church College, Oxford, to read law. He was a member of the Middle Temple, which was one of these slippery and furtive inns of court, which are sort of like almost Masonic organisations, which barristers belong to. And what's amazing is after he conducted this case, after he finished this case, he was made an MP. He was elected to Parliament. Strange. But I think the most suspicious element to do with John Cyril Maud is that he was head of MI5 Section B19. So he was an intelligence officer. Now, not only was he in MI5 and he was head of this section, but the particular section was one involved in human intelligence. It was the kind of division within the intelligence services that would track down the sources of rumours, things like that. So it's the kind of organisation that would be involved, if it was involved, in monitoring the activities of psychic mediums, like, for instance, Helen Duncan. It is the kind of outfit that would be employed to do that job if indeed Helen Duncan had been watched for all those years. So there's an interesting parallel here between John Maud being involved in this case against Helen Duncan and being part of this intelligence gathering network, which may well have been involved with her before then. Now, the choice of judge is interesting too. It is someone called Sir Gerald Dodson, and there was a letter. Now, there's a letter in existence actually, right? Sir Gerald Dodson was the Recorder of London, which means he was like the chief judge at the Old Bailey. And there is a letter from the Department of Public Prosecutions, which is today called the Crown Prosecution Service, which is specifically recommending Dodson to preside over the case of Helen Duncan. This could be because Dodson was also a Royal Navy officer. He was involved in charities to do with the Royal Navy, and so he'd been very emotionally affected by the sinking of the Hood and the Barham, which may be why he was brought in specifically. I think he'd have been easy to persuade, put it that way, to play along. They should say, well, Helen's, he'd have been affected. These ships have been sunk. The government wanted to keep it secret. Helen was spoiling it. That's a problem. Now, also involved in managing the case, who was briefing Maud, was a naval intelligence officer called Commander Ian Fleming. Now, he had a long history. He was a very experienced intelligence officer. He'd spied on the Spanish Civil War a few years earlier. He'd also monitored the Moscow show trials in 1933. So he's a very proficient secret agent indeed, and he would have been in the know. He'd have been the kind of person who would have been in the know if there had been a government intelligence operation against Helen Duncan. And I think that's why Robert Hartley chose to call his book Helen Duncan: The Mystery Show Trial. He chose to give it that title. Now, I must apologise actually to Robert Hartley because I didn't credit him in the film that I made, because I used several sources from the information I put in that film, but one of the most important was his book, so I'm crediting him now. Another thing about Ian Fleming was he was very keen on the paranormal and the occult. He was a friend of Aleister Crowley. He was involved in the magic that Aleister Crowley was talking about. He was also a member of the Society for Psychical Research. So he was a member of this organisation that was involved in actually scientifically proving things such as mediumship and psychic powers. So he'd basically have known the very same things that Firebrace did, Brigadier Roy Firebrace, who first alerted the government to the issues to do with Helen Duncan. So he must have known Firebrace, because they both moved in the intelligence circles, they both moved in the psychical research circles. Now, does the name Ian Fleming sound familiar to you? It should do, yeah. He's also, of course, the author of the books James Bond, of the character James Bond. He wrote the books on which the character James Bond is based, which of course has spawned a very successful film franchise which continues to this day. Now, the Defence Counsel was a guy called Charles Lowsby. Now, he was not a barrister, he was not a member of any of the Inns of Courts, but he was a highly experienced solicitor, and he was also a spiritualist, and he was a great promoter of spiritualism. He was very concerned by any problems spiritualists were getting from the state, things like that. He fought for spiritualist rights, basically, and he believed in Helen. He very, very badly wanted to win this case for Helen. He's very passionate about it indeed, but unfortunately he made some fatal mistakes. So the trial began, and it began with the witnesses who'd been at the Master Temple on the evening of January the 19th coming forward to report what they'd seen. They were split between the prosecution and the defence, and they told a very different story. The prosecution witnesses explained that they had been lured to the Master Temple with the promise of seeing something very unusual. So they came along to that venue in Portsmouth that night, paid 12 shillings to get in, which is a lot of money in those days, being told you're going to see something truly amazing, truly paranormal, out of the ordinary. And all they saw was Helen Duncan prancing around covered in a white sheet, speaking in strange voices. That's what they said. So the white sheet, right, where is it? This big white sheet, presumably it would be a major court exhibit, would it not? No, the white sheet was nowhere to be found. Let me say that again. The white sheet could not be found, and was not found at the scene. Just think about this. Just think about it for a moment. A white sheet big enough to cover a 20-stone woman. So we're talking about like a king-size bed sheet here. Was not there, right? This was a bed sheet that somehow Helen Duncan had managed to secrete somewhere, even though she was stripped naked and examined physically by a number of the sitters, by a number of independent witnesses, strangers. Lieutenant Worth and Rupert West, they said they'd grabbed this white sheet. One of the first things they did when they blew the whistle and switched their torches on to signify the start of the raid was they leapt forward from their seat in the second row and they grabbed the white sheet, this fake ectoplasm. The police were on the scene in a matter of moments. The lights went on, and somehow this white sheet was not found. What? This is crazier than Price's cheesecloth story. I mean, every time somebody these accusations made against Helen all the time, despite the fact that she was raided several times, none of this alleged material, very little of this alleged textile, has ever been produced. So we're supposed to believe that in the chaos of a police raid, with the lights switched on, officers entering the room, arresting, detaining all the people in there, arresting Helen, we're supposed to believe that somehow she and her accomplices managed to secrete a king-size bed sheet, which had already been grabbed by a police officer and a naval officer who were in the room, obviously as agents. And they managed to hide it somewhere. Did they? Now, one story that came out was that there was a woman in the front row. I can't remember her name, but she had a sling on an arm sling on, because she'd hurt one of her arms, and her arm was in this arm sling around, which basically secured her arm to her chest, as you've seen those kind of slings before, I'm sure. I think it was Worth who actually suggested that this woman actually managed to put this bed sheet into the sling, tuck it in there to secure it from view. That's just insane. I mean, it's just ludicrous. I mean, firstly, a woman with a bad arm has only one good working arm, managed to take a king-size bed sheet and shove it somehow, even if it fitted. It was actually very thin, loose cloth. Somehow fitted it into her sling with only one good working arm in the chaos of a police raid. Oh, give me a break. But this is what Worth said, because the reason he said it was because they didn't find the. They said because they couldn't find the sheet. I mean, it seems like it's a bit of a circular argument fallacy here. I'll talk more about that in a minute. But yeah, it really is crazy. But basically, this was a trial of witness testimonies. Okay, there was no physical evidence at all. It was just down to the witness testimonies. Now, the chief prosecution witness was Lieutenant Stanley Worth, who was one of the secret moles that had actually been in the seance, and he was the guy who was involved in the police raid. Basically, it was a setup, and he was the one who supposedly grabbed this sheet and then lost it again. Now, Stanley Worth, he was one of these sort of pillars of the community type people, you know, they were very trustworthy, supposedly, people. I had heard originally that he was still alive in New Zealand, but I've just been told that he has passed away, which is not surprising because he'd be pretty old by now. But he moved to New Zealand, which is quite convenient. It's New Zealand's a long way away, isn't it? It's on the other side of the world. It would take a very determined reporter from this country to track him down there, wouldn't it? Anyway, so Lieutenant Stanley Worth, he's this guy, very, very smart naval officer type chap, standing up in the dock. He was basically reported what all the other prosecution witnesses said. He said that he was lured to the Master Temple. What it was, he and his mates used to go to seances, okay? It was a form of entertainment for them. They called it going to the spooks. It was a sort of alternative to going to the cinema or down the pub. They say, what are we going to do tonight, lads? Say, hey, I feel like going for the spooks. Let's go to the spooks. It's a form of, like I said, it's a sort of night out kind of thing. And so he visited a couple of Helen's seances earlier on, and like he said, he reported what the prosecution witnesses said. He saw Helen prancing around, pretending to be a ghost when she was just some fat woman underneath a white sheet. And he decided it was his duty to bring her to justice. So he called his contacts in the police and told them what was going on, and this is why the raid took place. And for no other reason than that. It was his motivations were purely personal. Worth's links to the police force are actually quite interesting, and I think it makes it more than coincidental that he decided to dedicate so much time and energy into this quest for this righteous indignation, this moral crusade of his against Helen Duncan. Yeah, firstly, he's the son of a senior policeman. He's the nephew of another one. He himself, before the war, was a special branch officer. He's also a close friend of Chief Constable Arthur West, who is as I said, he's the Chief Constable of Portsmouth. He's a friend of the family, and he knew the police officer commanding the raid as well. So interesting little coincidence. He's starting to look a little bit like John Maud, actually, in terms of his connections, shall we say? The most suspicious thing of all about Worth was he lied under oath. He committed perjury. Loseby asked him, he says, are you involved in the intelligence services yourself, Lieutenant Worth? And he replied, no, sir. That's not true. Worth was he was a naval intelligence officer. He was in the Naval Provost Special Investigations Division, which is kind of like he was kind of like a detective. He's kind of like a naval intelligence detective. So why did he lie in court when asked that question? So, I mean, when he was asked why he decided to do what he did, he said he was spying on his own account, whatever the hell that means. But was he? I mean, like I say, he was a Naval Provost Intelligence Officer. He's the kind of person, actually, who would who would be employed to do something like this if the government did decide to crack down on Helen Duncan. He's the kind of guy they'd bring in because of his position. Okay, he's the kind of guy who might be reporting to people like Fleming and Maud within the MI5's section B19. You see what I mean? It's weird, isn't it? So basically, the prosecution team in this trial, included that is the prosecution barrister and the witnesses, particularly Worth, are starting to look, and Chief Constable Arthur West, are starting to look like some kind of secret cabal. There's something even more suspicious as well. The defence found out that Worth had a friend in Oxford, of all places, where I live, who had a bet on, he put on a bet before Helen's arrest, and he said that he bet that Helen would be arrested on January the 16th in Portsmouth, and that the arresting officer's name and the chief prosecution witness's name would be Stanley Worth. Well, I guess a rather a long sweep that is. Anyway, guess what? This guy won his bet. How did he know? Well, it turns out this guy, as I said, is a friend of Worth. There's only one way he could have known, and that is if it was planned beforehand, and that Worth had let it slip to this person that that was what was going to happen. I mean, who knows? Maybe Worth had a cut in the bet. And to cap it all, back into Helen's life comes her old nemesis, Harry Price. As you know, Harry Price had been on a case for 14 years since that debacle of an experimental study in 1930. He'd also assisted Esmé Maule in trying to bring her down in 1932. And back he comes again. And this is really strange because he was actually brought in to brief the prosecution witnesses. Now, I don't know if anyone watching this is a lawyer, but isn't that rather irregular? I mean, Victor Zamet, he's a lawyer, and he said it was. It means that the prosecution witnesses, all of them, were coached. There's no other word to use. They were coached by Harry Price at the request of the prosecution, at the request of Fleming and Maud. Is that normal procedure in Crown courts? See, this is starting to look to me just thinking like an attempt to pervert the course of justice. So, as I said, the testimony of the prosecution witnesses was really, it was all the same. They said the curtains opened, a human figure appeared that looked like Helen Duncan. She was draped in the white sheet. But as I said, there was no white sheet. I mean, Loseby didn't miss out on this one. He questioned Worth about this. He said, well, come off it, mate. You grabbed the white sheet, so where is it? Didn't you keep it as an exhibit and hand it over to the police? I mean, Loseby actually continued questioning Worth on this. He said, so where's your sheet? The sheet, this sheet would have been such a vital piece of evidence, and it was not recovered. And Worth said, he said, someone hid it. Someone must have hidden it just in time. And like I already said, in the chaos of a police raid, the lights were on, etc., etc. Someone hid it, even though he grabbed hold of it already. And as I said before, this is a circular argument, because Loseby actually said, well, how do you know someone hid it just in time? And Worth replied, well, how else could we fail to have found it? So you see, this is this circular argument of fallacy. If we did this, the skeptics would be onto us like greyhounds out the trap. The sheet was there, but someone grabbed it and hid it, and took it out away from us and grabbed it and hid it, so we couldn't find it. How do you know that? Well, how else could we fail to have found it? See what I mean? It's strange actually, because the police were on the scene, as I said, within moments, yet they did not carry out a search. They didn't search any. They detained everyone in the room. They didn't search any of them, especially not the lady with the arm sling. The defence witnesses were very different. The defence witnesses had received no coaching that I'm aware of, that I've heard of. They report that Helen Duncan was seated in the seat. The curtains were closed. She went into trance, and then a white semi-fluid substance issued from between the sides of the curtains, and this fluid turned into a humanoid shape. It actually floated in the air and then turned into the shape of certain people. Albert, Peggy, who were Albert and Peggy, who were Helen's spirit guides, and then they introduced other people who then appeared in the ectoplasm, including people who some members of the audience recognised. Mrs. Ann Potter, who was in the front row, she recognised her own mother. She spoke to her own mother. She held her hand. She even kissed her. And she said that the ectoplasm formed into her mother's face, even down to the moles, the distinctive moles on her face. Anne said she was close enough up to touch, to kiss, and to embrace her mother, who had died. And there was absolutely no doubt about it. These people were absolutely positive. And Loseby went through each one of them one by one, and they told the court what they had seen. Now this here is actually the place where the Master Temple used to be. It's in Copner Road, Portsmouth, and what it is, this is actually quite an old picture from Google Earth. That there, the shop up below, is actually a jeweller shop now. It's called the 301 Jewellers. It's at 301 Copner Road. And the room above, you see that bay window at the top on the upper floor? That's where the Master Temple was. Now, in the old days, when it was the Master Temple, the shop below was actually a chemist shop run by Mr. and Mrs. Homer, who also ran the Master Temple and used to host Helen at her seances whenever they could. And what happened was people would enter the shop through the chemist shop, they go up some stairs at the back and into the Master Temple. Today it's different, it's changed. The door used to be in the middle, it's now moved to the left hand side, and there's some stairs going up the side of the house from the front rather than the middle from the back. And basically this the actual Master Temple now is actually the lounge in a flat. I've actually been there to visit it, and I'd just like to actually give you a little guided tour. Now this is actually a clip from my film Helen Duncan, the most dangerous psychic in the world, and so you can see the rest of that film. Actually, it's on YouTube. It's completely free, and it's on my channel. So this is a little clip where I show you round the Master Temple. And here we are in the Master Temple. Well, it's not the Master Temple anymore. It's actually a lounge in the flat above the shop. As you can see here, it's just a pretty ordinary lounge, very elegant, well decorated lounge. Just to get people to get their bearings, in this corner here where the TV is, that was where Helen had her cubicle. There was a black curtain across here, and Helen would be inside sitting on the chair. Now here there were rows of seats, and there was over 40 people in this room. You could get quite a lot in, so you can imagine there was a lot of people. But this room was slightly bigger because this here is a partition, and we'll come out here and I'll just show you. This stairway wasn't there. The stairway actually came up through there, and there was this passageway that led down to the chemist shop, to the Homer's shop, and people used to come in here, they'd pay downstairs, come up here and take a seat. This light would be switched off, and there'd just be a 40-watt red bulb on a shelf over here, which is no longer there. And Albert often used to say, you know, can you dim that light by putting a handkerchief over it or something? So there'd be rows of seats here. You can imagine people packed in quite close together. I imagine I understand how Mrs. Potter, I'll be telling you about Mrs. Potter later, but she was in the front row, so she'd have had her knees almost up to the cubicle. This bay here, this would have been covered by a blackout blind, this window, because it was wartime. But this is the original step on the bench. Now this is covered over, the present owner of the house has covered that over, but that is the original footsteps. So some of the spectators would actually sit on here, and they'd actually sit on this bench with their feet there, and they'd watch Helen from this side, with this blackouted window behind. The current residents of this property have told me that there are strange goings on in this area. Now I'm not the first person to come to this building because of Helen Duncan. Helen's granddaughter has been over here. Mediums have been here as well. The lady who lives here has told me that she's seen a cat. That is interesting because animals did sometimes materialise in these physical mediumship sessions. She's seen several other things like her footsteps and things like that, and So other strange things have happened here. So, so this, ladies and gentlemen, is the Master Temple. I'm very grateful to the lady who lives here for allowing me to come up here and have a look around. Much appreciated. So, amazing to think, isn't it? It's changed a lot, but it's still the same. The fireplace is still there. Still the same room, and some of it is even still in the form it was in the 1940s. Now these here are the actual official record of the trial. There are papers related to this trial that are still classified. They're in the National Archives in the secure section, but this is the minutes of the trial of Helen Duncan. All the details are written up in here, including what everyone said, and it's published by the Central Criminal Court, and you can actually get a copy if you want to have a look. Now this is the most exciting part of the story comes now, because at this point Charles Loseby, Helen Duncan's defence counsel, decided, like I said, to get the case dismissed. What he would do, he would get Helen to hold a seance in the courtroom and so prove she was a genuine psychic, and so dismiss the case instantly. And he quotes here, which is in this book: "If Mrs. Duncan is a materialisation medium, then there is a spirit world here near her at this moment, and a guide right here, possibly waiting for an opportunity to help her. Let us call him. Yes, here, in the Central Criminal Court of London. Why not? She requires a curtained off partition and a red light. Nothing more." So petitioned Loseby to the court, and but Dodson refused. He refused point blank. He said no way. So the defence counsel appealed, and Dodson agreed to poll the jury. So the judge himself overruled it first of all, but then they basically objected. The defence objected, so he said okay, he'll poll the jury. So the jury is just basically, like I said, they take a vote on whether they want to see this seance in the courtroom. The jury said no. He polled them, and they voted no. I mean, WTF? I mean, Loseby wanted Helen to hold a seance in the middle of the court, in front of the jury, in front of all the judge, in front of the public gallery, all the reporters, the newsmen, in front of photographers, and it's, well, they're not photographers, but in front of all those people. And the jury said, no thanks, don't want to see it. I mean, that's extraordinary, it really is. I mean, who wouldn't want to see something like that? My goodness me, I mean, if you were in that jury, would you really vote no for the chance to see something like that? A spectacle which you normally have to pay 12 shillings for? Good grief. You get to see this amazing thing for nothing? Blimey. I mean, personally, I would want to see that simply for my own personal curiosity, let alone because it's relevant to the case. Very relevant indeed. So that was it. No live seance. Now, from a lawyer's point of view, it's legally understandable in a way, because they could always say, well, spiritualism is not on trial here. Okay, that's not really the point of the case, if you want to be too over-literal about it. The point of the case was not even to prove whether or not Helen Duncan was a genuine psychic medium. The point of the case was to prove whether or not Helen Duncan used fakery that day on the 16th of January 1944. That's all that the case was about. It didn't matter if Helen Duncan was the best psychic medium in the world. It didn't matter if she could pop out ectoplasmic entities left, right and bleeding centre. The point was that she hadn't done it that day, on the 16th of January 1944 at 8:30 p.m. at the Master Temple in Portsmouth. That was the point of the case and nothing more. So if you want to be very literal and very sort of like legal about it, that's the position you would take. However, I mean, on a common sense level, let's face it, right? If Helen had done a seance in court and proved her abilities in front of everyone, it would have devastated the Crown's case. Because then the prosecution would have to need to prove why a genuine psychic medium would need to cheat. I mean, Maud and Elam were portraying her as this ruthless harridan, this shyster, this mountebank, this charlatan, who used magic tricks to pretend she was talking to the dead. And And that, if Loseby had done it and Helen had carried out her seance, that would have been the end of it. Finished. Also, I mean, as I've said earlier, it looks as if Maud, Worth, Dodson, they were all in league together. And there's nothing they couldn't stoop to. I think they were on a mandate to put Helen away, for reasons I'll come to. She was framed, and they needed to get her into jail, for reasons I will come to. And there's no lengths they wouldn't go to get her into jail, including the rigging of jury polls. So, really, that was the end for the defence case anyway. Loseby had played his ace and it hadn't worked. On Friday the 31st of March, the judge summed up and the jury retired to consider their verdict, and it took just half an hour. They came back guilty. The following Monday, Chief Constable Arthur West, he basically assassinated her character. As I explained before, he called her... This is Chief Constable Arthur West, who was the Chief Constable of the police force that arrested her in the first place, who was a family friend of the Chief Prosecution Witness, and was also accused of framing another guy in the court next door. He wasn't actually legally accused, but the defendant claimed that West framed him. And he said that Helen was this pest on society, this ruthless exploiter of the most vulnerable and grief-stricken people. And so the judge, really, that was all he needed. He gave her the maximum sentence, 9 months in Holloway prison. And as Helen was taken down, she shouted out in her broad Scottish accent, "Oh, I haven't even done anything! Oh God, is there a God?" In June, Helen appealed against her sentence, and the appeal was turned down, and she was not released until the very end of her sentence, when the entire sentence was complete, on Friday the 22nd of December. Mr. and Mrs. Homer, the couple who ran the chemist shop and the Master Temple, they received a suspended sentence as accessories. So, while Helen was languishing in her cell at Holloway Prison, on the 6th of June, there was a mass amphibious landing of Allied forces in Normandy, France, in what was Operation Overlord. This highly secretive operation got underway, and it was a huge success. And a history would come to know it as D-Day. Now this here is Julius Caesar, and he's a very interesting chap indeed, because I think he's a case in point. This link, which I'll be talking about this evening, the link between the supernatural and warfare, is older and more common than you might think. Now this guy used to consult a soothsayer before going into battle, and so did Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great had a personal soothsayer who came from Morocco, or what is now Morocco, and used to guide Alexander throughout his military campaigns. And you may have heard the story of what happened in 1429, because the King of France decided to put a young peasant girl called Jeanne Roumet in charge of the French army. And of course, we all know this. It's quite a famous story, because she was Joan of Arc. And we all know that the king put her in charge of the army because he believed she was receiving divine guidance from God. And of course, under her command, the French won an enormous victory at the Siege of Orleans against the English. Unfortunately, young Joan of Arc was captured and killed, but maybe she was some kind of psychic being guided. And all through the Cold War, I mean, this is actually all coming out now. Both sides used things like remote viewing, psychic spying, to spy on each other. I mean, Uri Geller, the famous TV psychic, the spoonbender, he was involved in this. The Soviets had their own version of it. Mossad, the CIA, used him. The Soviet Union had their own version of this. John Ronson wrote, I mean, you may have seen the film The Men Who Stare at Goats. It's based on a book by John Ronson. The book is a lot better than the film. But I'm saying this is nothing new, and this is, despite the fact there is official denial of this phenomenon, it does go on. You know, the governments and authorities laugh at the idea of spirit guides, psychic powers, remote viewing, etc. But secretly, privately, they take it very seriously indeed. Now, the official story of Helen Duncan is that it's this open and shut case. She was a fake, she was a fraud, she was a magician using tricks to make people think she was a psychic. She was caught fair and square and given a fair trial, and she was convicted rightly and sent down for it, and did 9 months in jail for her crimes. Good. She deserved it. But I'm going to offer you an alternative hypothesis, and let's just see if it makes more sense than the official story. I'm going to put it to you, to use the language of the lawyers, based on what we've seen about the paranormal matters and statesmanship. Helen Duncan was a real physical medium, and she was targeted by the powers that be because she was a security risk. This was because she was able to contact people with government secrets who had died. So this represented an unpluggable leak, and she was put away. Agents within the police and the judiciary framed her. The reason was because of D-Day. D-Day was a massive organisational operation which had to be completely secret. It was what, to use my own terminology, it was a very top-heavy conspiracy. Thousands of people knew about it, yet all of them had to keep quiet. One little slip and it was all over. Surprise and unexpectedness was absolutely paramount. In fact, the government even staged false flag kind of raids on southern Italy to make them think they were going to land there, including false documents being put on bodies and things like that for the enemy to find. There was a massive amount of disinformation and secrecy relating to D-Day. I mean, there's even a fake village down in Dorset. You can actually visit it to this day. I think it's a museum. You can actually go in there. And they built this fake village as part of the training operations. Now, so they went to an enormous amount of trouble to prevent the secret of D-Day leaking out. They knew how precarious the situation was. It would only take one person who knew the secrets of D-Day to die before June the 6th, and only one Nazi spy in Helen's seances, and when this man came through, for the entire operation to be muffed. I mean, in a way, I'm glad. There's a part of me that's glad that Helen was put in jail, because I think if the case had fallen apart and Helen had been set free, then they'd have probably killed her. They really would. It's silly, really, if you think about it, because, well, think about Helen, right? Helen was a patriotic woman, and like most people in the country, she was 100% behind the war effort. If they just paid her a couple of £100 a month, which is probably more than what she was earning, just in the run-up to D-Day, just asked them, didn't have to tell her why, they just said, just don't do any seances for the next couple of months, do you mind? She'd probably have agreed. She'd have signed the Official Secrets Act, she'd have taken the money, she'd have lived she'd have lived at least as well off as she would have done if she'd been working, only she wouldn't have to work. And to be honest, it would have cost an awful lot less than the trial to put her away. Now, one of the explanations for the fact that Helen, one of the explanations you'll hear from people who don't believe Helen was a fake medium was that, well, lots and lots of people in government thought she was just because they believed in spiritualism. Why? Because the Prime Minister did. And it's true that Winston Churchill was a believer in spiritualism. And so the theory is there was some kind of climate of woo hanging over governments. This is what a lot of the critics of John Ronson's book say as well about remote viewing. But is it? That's the question. But is it? We shall see. But it's not, actually. You see, that's not the case. Because it turns out that Churchill wasn't even in the loop. He was not even... It's clear that he was maybe the Prime Minister, but he was not cleared for this plan. Because, you see, he commented himself on the case on the 3rd of April. But this is long after it began. This is when he must have read about it in the newspapers. He sent a memo to the Home Secretary. This memo exists. We know it. You can see it. We found it. And it goes, "Let me have a report on why the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was used in a modern court of justice. What was the cost of this trial to the state, observing that the witnesses were brought from Portsmouth and maintained here in this crowded London for a fortnight, and the recorder kept busy with all this obsolete tomfoolery, to the detriment of necessary work of the courts." You see, Churchill, he was the Prime Minister, but he knew nothing about this. They hadn't told him. Whoever was running this show, they decided the Prime Minister was they could not trust the Prime Minister to know about it. Now, this here is a modern news report on Helen Duncan. I say it's probably for one of the anniversaries. I don't know which one. Maybe the 60th in 2004 or the 50th in 1994. I'm not sure. But it says here, jailed as a witch, branded as a spy. I mean, I don't think there's anyone left alive now who knows the true answer to this. There's documentary evidence. I don't know of any people alive left who actually attended any of Helen's seances, certainly not the seances at that time. The last person who probably knew this secret, who was part of this cabal, this conspiracy, this framing, was Stanley Worth, who died recently, according to the latest figures, according to the latest my latest information. Last time he was interviewed, I think he was in the mid-90s. He was interviewed for a documentary, and he stands by what he said at the time. His story is still the same. He says he went to the spooks for a laugh. He saw Helen Duncan there, who was fake, and he decided to bring her to justice. He decided to ruin her day for purely personal reasons, for no other motives than his own personal quest for justice and righteousness and good taste. Maybe he was just doing his duty for king and country by continuing to lie. It's possible he believed it himself. He told the lie so many times. There's a parallel in fiction here, and I don't know how many of you Panwo TV viewers are into science fiction, but there's a great science fiction writer who lives locally, actually, in Oxford, and he's called Brian Aldiss. And he wrote a series of books called the Heliconia trilogy. And one of them in particular, Heliconia Winter, was very interesting because basically what the plot is that it's set on this alien planet, okay, and on this planet, all the alien beings that live there, they all have mediumistic abilities, and they all are able to go into a trance and commune with their dead ancestors. And they take this for granted, just like breathing or sleeping. They regularly go into this trance. It's called PAUK, P-A-U-K, and they do it all the time. And it's interesting is that the government on the planet outlaws PAUK at one point. They say you can no longer go into PAUK. Any person caught going into PAUK will be executed, etc., etc. And the reason for this is because the people who've died are coming back, and when living people are in PAUK, they're telling them things which they wouldn't otherwise be able to know, because these dead people are there. And of course, because they're dead, they can't be silenced, they can't be threatened, they can't be killed if they talk too much and know too much, etc., etc. So I think that's very interesting indeed. And Brian Aldiss, I don't know if he's still alive, but he was a journalist originally. He was a journalist from in the 1950s and so. And I wonder if he knew about the case of Helen Duncan, and maybe it inspired him to write the Heliconia trilogy. I don't know. Now here's Helen again. She's looking a lot older now, and troubled with age and experience. This I think was taken after the Witchcraft Trial. She was eventually, of course, she did 9 months inside and then came out. After she was released from prison in September 1944, she went back to her old business. She carried on doing seances and spiritualist churches. An unsinkable rubber ducky, as James Randi would say. Helen Duncan was the last person to be tried under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. After that, it was repealed. However, it was replaced, in a sense, by the Fraudulent Mediums Act of 1951, which did make life very difficult for Helen and for many other people. And that was not repealed until 2008. And luckily, there's been no equivalent since. Just what they've done is skeptics have tried to give mediums a hard time by using various existing consumer laws. There's no specific law related to psychic mediums. I'm sure many skeptics would bring one in if they could. I've talked about this before many times. You know, the skeptocracy. I made a video about that. You know, but despite that, despite any amount of legislation, the government has never come down as hard on any medium as they did on Helen Duncan in 1944. Never, not once, before or since. Helen Duncan carried out her last seance on the 28th of October 1956, and that was at, well, coincidentally, where I did this lecture at Truthjuice Nottingham. It was at the West Bridgeford Spiritualist Church. Now, that church, I've been there actually, occupies its own premises now. It has its own little room in a building, so it's got its own sort of, it's a proper church, so to speak. But it used to be in a private house. It used to be in someone's home, just like the Master Temple. And I actually went to visit the house where the seance room used to be, and there's no I mean, the people there were actually very, very indignant, and they were not as accommodating by far as the people in Portsmouth had been at the Master Temple, the old Master Temple. And there's no question of me going in and filming in the room where it used to be. But what I did was I filmed outside the house in the street, and I got the house in shot. Someone came out and told me to stop filming. They were very, very indignant, and they were very, very uppity about it. And I got the feeling, actually, because I spoke to several people at the Spiritualist Church, and also one of the neighbours a few doors along, and I got the feeling it's still quite an alarming subject. It still has, even after all these years since it happened, it's worrying. It still worries people. It still concerns them, and they don't like people delving into it. They told me to let it go, and like I said, I'm not going to let it go. But you can actually see this in my film. I was actually there for my film, and I actually capture it on camera when it happens. It's very interesting. But anyway, this was in Nottingham. So you can she did her last seance in Nottingham. She was at this house carrying out her seance in the seance room, like she always did, using the same practices that she was used to, and everyone else is used to. Once again, it was a police raid. The police burst into the house, into the seance room, switched on the lights, and grabbed Helen. And Helen was badly injured. She suffered second-degree burns to her chest and throat. And this is apparently what can happen to a medium if they are disturbed while in trance. This is why the lights are switched off, the doors are locked, everyone is told to sit quietly and not move. Because a medium disturbed in trance, when ectoplasm is outside them, is apparently very dangerous for the medium, and Helen did indeed suffer these very serious injuries. So Helen was admitted to the local hospital. She was treated there for her burns. When she was free from hospital, when she was discharged from hospital, she went back home to where she was living in Edinburgh. But she was really, really badly hurt, and on the 6th of December, she died. Now there is a bit of a question mark over whether the injury she sustained in Nottingham was the actual cause of her death. The fact of the matter is, she was never a well woman. She was in poor health all her life, and there's no way she was going to live to a ripe old age. So many people have said that was actually the fact of the matter was that there's no direct causal link. However, she did actually sustain an injury which led to further complications, which was the cause of her death. It was the cause of her death. So Helen Duncan, who had spent her life communing with spirits of the dead, became one of these spirits herself at the age of 59. She entered the spirit world and left her body behind. And it's safe to say that the police killed her. Even though, there was a couple of months between the attack and her death, the police did kill her. And there's a campaign to get her pardon. I mean, there was a campaign going on. I mean, Helen has been in regular contact ever since, and she comes through to various mediums at times, including members of her family. And as I said, I'm in touch now with one of her granddaughters. She has quite a number of grandchildren, and some great-grandchildren, I think, and even, I think, a couple of great-great-grandchildren. And there is a campaign now to get her pardoned and to get her conviction reversed. And this is something that her granddaughter is involved in. And I wish them luck. I wish them a lot of luck. Anyway, I do recommend the book Helen Duncan, The Mystery Show Trial by Robert Hartley. It's a lot of the material I've used for this lecture comes from that. It's basically it's a self-published book from 2007 that reassesses all the evidence from its primary source, that is the court transcript documents, and the court transcript, the other documents associated with it, and it paints a very different picture of Helen Duncan to the official story that we know of. Now, the question has to be asked if there may be a deeper, more fundamental strategy going on here. something related to a long-term goal on the behalf of the manipulators of the masters of reality, whatever they choose to call themselves, the masters of infinity, the Illuminati. Take your pick, what word you choose. Maybe there's something more going on here than just simply the reasons. Say what happened to Helen was a conspiracy, and my hypothesis is right. It may not just be about putting Helen away for D-Day. It may be connected to why. There may be another reason why Helen was not allowed to perform in the court a seance. Because if she had, what would have happened? I mean, I always say that, well, Helen would have won the case, but could the trial even have gone on? Would any of the people involved be in a fit state to conduct the rest of the trial? Now, governments don't like change. They assess change. They assess anything that might cause change, any idea, any invention, any discovery, extremely carefully, if they think it might cause change in this world. Because it's all to do with their relationship with us, what they think of us, what we think of them, the relationship between we who are ruled and those who rule us. And everything that ever comes out that might change that relationship is thoroughly vetted by a whole array, a whole sector of think tanks, psychological media control organisations, various usually to do with psychological and cultural and sociological studies, things like that. And nothing ever gets into the public domain without this process. They want to keep us in a state where we can be governed effectively, and if they can't, if something comes along which might jeopardise that, they will restrict our access to it, and they will restrict and even block its availability if necessary. Now, understand, this is not my point of view. This is not what I think. This is not what I believe. I'm seeing things from their point of view, and that this is why they do it. I mean, other good examples are, I've spoken before in other videos about free energy, the Roswell incident, things like that. They will restrict access to knowledge which may improve our lives enormously. Scientific discoveries, for instance. I mean, I mentioned free energy. If they think that there will be a price to pay on their side when it comes to their relationship with us, their ability to control and to dominate us. And so, connecting it back to Helen Duncan again and what happened to her, you've got to ask yourself, is this one of the things they've kept from us? What do you reckon, eh? Do you think this is one of the secrets that they're keeping from us? Could it be? Well, if so, why? Now, a lot of people believe that when we die, we don't disappear. We do continue to live in another form, and there is a spirit world or heaven or whatever else you want to call it that we go to. Now, what's the harm in that, you might think? Now, there's not many. The thing about it is, I mean, one obvious answer is religion, because this is the only thought form we are permitted within the mainstream relating to this subject. I'm talking about purely organised religions here: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, etc. I can't speak for other religions, but the threat from those institutions is very obvious. And remember that religious institutions are enormously powerful. The Vatican is one of the richest and most influential organisations on earth. The threat to these, the threat of loss of power to these institutions is obvious, because in a sense, especially within the Christian world, these are the institutions which essentially hold the key to this afterlife. If you want to go to an afterlife which is in any way pleasant and nice and not burning in hell, then you can only go through them. And I wouldn't include spiritualism as an organised religion. It doesn't have any centrally controlled power structure. It doesn't have any, in a sense, full organisational worth. I mean, it doesn't have really a catechism as such. There are a few minor, maybe there are 3-4 line constitutions for various churches, but there's no sort of rule book in the same way that the other religions have. Very few influential people have been spiritualists. Very few powerful people have been spiritualists. But except Winston Churchill, of course, is probably the most senior person in the public eye who's ever been a spiritualist. The only permitted alternative to organised religion within the mainstream is to be an atheist, to be a materialistic atheo-skeptics like Richard Dawkins, for instance, and people like that who believe that there is no God and there's no afterlife at all, and basically we are just mechanism, and when our bodies die, we die forever. That's it, the end. Now, what if that's not true? If that's not true, then why would the government keep that quiet? This is an important question. Now, could there be a secular reason why the authorities would want to cover up the existence of life after death? And I mean, if it was ever proven true that they would, somehow that would be a detriment to their power hold over us, which is one of these things they've kept from us. When I say proven true, I don't mean people believing in it, because of course people already believe in it. Lots of people, probably the majority, believe in some form of afterlife. But to have that proven true by that big Freudian father figure, the government, is a very, very different matter to people privately believing it or independently believing it. To have it confirmed officially would be an enormous impact on society. That's an important point. The government do not want us to know about this. For whatever reason, the authorities have got together, and through their think tanks and their vetting process, they've decided that this is one of the things that they need to keep from us. They give us other options. They say things like, well, you can believe in an off-the-shelf package religion, for one of the organised religions, or you can be a Richard Dawkins style atheist. Either one of those is fine, but no third option is permitted. And it's very interesting actually reading the Church's official position on spiritualism. For instance, the Church of England. Now, Margaret Hahn, Helen's granddaughter, has sent me some documents which were published in the Psychic News, and they are basically the minutes of a meeting or a report on a meeting between various bishops in 1938, I believe. So this is around the time when Helen was practicing. And they say it's quite odd actually, because although they say that they don't accept spiritualism as real, they say, because it doesn't involve the Christian, the official Christian version of God. They do say that they don't see any harm in it, but they do. What's really interesting is in the sense in a way, as I predicted on other videos that I've made, they stand shoulder to shoulder and unite with the skeptics. And there's very often in several different places in this document they refer to psychical research experiments that have proved have come up with supported the skeptical position. And I think that's extremely interesting, because it's rather like they're appearing to be. It's rather like a situation which David Icke talks about. He talks about opposames, where things appear to be opposite and they're the same, such as organised religion and skeptical science are portrayed as opposites, but on another level they're the same. And this is an example, I think, of what David Icke talks about. Well, now, so the thing is, when it comes down to the grassroots of the sort of atheist world, I know exactly what motivates them, and I've spoken about it before many, many times. And I'm going to play. I played this before in my videos. It's fair use. This is it's commentary and it's commentary and criticism. So this is a fair use reproduction. But just have a listen to this. It just perfectly sums up what I always talk about when I start going on one of my rants about MBA.
Oh, you people who are humanists, how awful, how pointless, how meaningless, how dry and arid and without form and purpose is your life. Humanism is nihilism. If there is no God, no future life, and the universe is a totally natural phenomenon, the universe has no purpose. That means our lives are meaningless. We might as well have never lived, because nothing means anything. I'm still young. I can do text speak. Is this text speak? No, it's not, is it? It's something else. Oh, I don't know. Anyway. pointlessness. Bertrand Russell responded to this very well, in a sense, by pointing out that what lies behind this is a fear of death. It's a fear of death. This is the problem here. Religion, he said, religion, since it has its source in terror, he didn't pull his punches. Religion, since it has its source in terror, has dignified certain sorts of fear and made people think them not disgraceful. In this it has done mankind a great disservice. All fear is bad. I believe that when I die I shall rot, and nothing of my ego will survive. I am not young, and I love life. But I should scorn to shiver with terror at the thought of annihilation. Many a man has borne himself proudly on the scaffold. Surely the same pride should teach us to think truly about our place in the world. And that's an important part of the response to this idea. Yes, okay, death is the end of our lives. Maybe that's a scary thing. Maybe that can be a frightening thing. But the response to that fact about reality, if you want to live your life in correspondence with the world as it is, and not the world as you would like it to be, is not to give in to some sort of better alternative that makes you feel better, but to be brave. To be braver than perhaps you feel like being, and to confront reality and to live a better life in accordance with the facts of reality as a result.
MBA. 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 I've done that one. I've done a whole video about Andrew Copson and his MBA. I even sent him his MBA, actually. I don't know if he got it. I've done a video about that, you can see. But can I play amateur psychologist for a moment? I hope no one minds if I play amateur psychologist. There's nothing... Sorry, I know... Honestly, there's nothing I hate worse than an amateur psychologist. Apart, perhaps, from a professional one. Now, Andrew Copson, of course, is an atheoskeptic, and he doesn't believe in any afterlife. And, as I said, I've made a whole video about this. But, it's a comedy video, by the way. But I think, you see, you can understand from listening to him there exactly why he wouldn't be pleased if it turned out that there was an afterlife. And this was proven beyond all doubt and accepted by the authorities. Because, of course, he wouldn't be brave anymore. He wouldn't be special anymore. I think he sees himself as some kind of heroic figure. And Bertrand Russell did very much, who he quotes there. He sees himself as a sort of... It makes you kind of... I mean, Richard Dawkins actually said, it makes you... There's a kind of nobility, he said. There's a nobility of living a life while not believing in the afterlife. And I've also made a film about that. Another comedy film. I've put links everybody in the description box. Oh, if I remember them. But you can find them in my video collection anyway. These people, if it was proved there was an afterlife, these people would lose a lot of what I think provides a proportion of their self-esteem. This vainglorious backslapping they go in for. I don't believe in the afterlife, man. Look at me, I'm so brave. I can get through my life without that crutch. I can get out of my bed knowing that I'm going to die, not like you weak, inferior fools who believe in this comforting myth. You see what I mean? So, in a sense, what effect would it have on society if it was universally accepted that we don't die, that we live forever, and that we are spiritual beings having a human experience, to use that old cliche? I think it would have an enormous impact in many, many ways, which the authorities are frightened of. Of course, our attitude towards dying would change enormously. This would be the primary impact on society. It would eliminate fear of death, or reduce it enormously compared to what it is today, I think. The knowledge that we would have nothing to fear, we either from a vengeful God that would send us to hell, or eternal oblivion. Those two things that create the fear of death. These are the things that people are afraid of most. That weight would be immediately lifted from all our shoulders. Grief, the pain of losing a loved one, that would be enormously reduced. It would be far easier to deal with when somebody you love dies. Of course, I mean, the sadness wouldn't be eliminated. There would still be sadness when somebody dies, but it would be a very different kind of sadness, far less painful, I think, for most people, because the knowledge of the existence of an afterlife means that it would represent simply a temporary loss, a temporary separation from the one you love. They've died, but it wouldn't be a permanent loss. You would eventually meet them again. You knew that it was a temporary separation between you and another person, which would inevitably end with a happy reunion one day. Now, if you step into the shoes of the people who rule the world, would you be able to govern a world where everyone has that knowledge? I think the rulers of this world have asked that question, and I think the answer they have come up with is no. I'm not exactly sure why. I mean, this is an ongoing kind of research for me. This is an ongoing thing that I'm looking into, and I haven't got all the answers yet. I'm not sure of every single issue at stake here. But I know that there is a reason for it. Maybe I'll do another video dedicated to this subject. But I know the cover-up is a long way from ending. A very long way from ending. And this could be another reason why they did that to Helen Duncan. Especially the bit where Loseby wanted to have the seance in the courtroom. And Dodson said no. And they fiddled the jury poll to make sure that it wouldn't happen. They don't mind. They'll let us have our private beliefs. They'll let us have our spiritualist churches. They can't. I think they would shut them down if they could, but they can't. But they will never acknowledge it. That's the point. They will never allow that to happen. And the conspiracy against Helen Duncan is, in a sense, is just one manifestation of the conspiracy against us all. And that is why I said at the beginning, this is so relevant to the modern world. It's so relevant to us and our lives and what we go through. Now, Helen Duncan has a Wikipedia page which is extraordinarily biased and deeply misleading. And I tried to edit that page. And I went through the rules. I know the rules of Wikipedia, okay? I didn't just do it willy-nilly. I went through the rule book and I made sure I put in the proper sources to the information, etc., etc. So I did it according to the rule book of Wikipedia. I edited Helen Duncan's page to make it more informing and more intellectually honest. It was edited back within the hour. I kid you not. Somebody must have been watching that page and they made sure to remove what I changed, put it back like it was before. I think it might be locked now, that page. I'm not sure. So if there is a cover-up, and I think it is, I think there is, it's still going on. Still going on to this day. This doesn't mean it will go on forever. As with free energy and the UFOs and everything, this might come out. If it does, we will find ourselves living in a very, very different world indeed. Perhaps one transformed even more than the knowledge of UFOs and free energy would. So that's something I look forward to. That's another disclosure, I think, that we need to fight for. I mean, who knows? Maybe in the future we'll be in a situation where it's actually quite normal to do what Loseby wanted to do in court, to actually subpoena a ghost, and maybe we'd have Albert on the stand giving evidence. You never know. That could actually happen. On the other hand, I could be deluded. I could be completely wrong, and maybe some of you watching this will think that I'm wrong. That's okay. You might think that Helen Duncan is a charlatan. She's using all the magician's tricks. Like I said, she went to jail. She belonged in jail. Good. She got what she deserved. Good job. She died when she did, etc., etc., etc. She's just using cheesecloth. But as I have demonstrated in this film, I think, if she is using cheesecloth, then it's some kind of mystical, levitating super cheesecloth. Or is that cheesecloth all the way down? Thank you for watching. Hospital Porters, Pride and Dignity, Stop the New World Order.